you've now done 2 podcasts with me, and I feel like I got you to do them in part on slightly false pretenses, in that I promised you we would be able to rant about Warhammer 40,000, our shared love of the game and its lore, and then I proceeded to just pepper you with geopolitical questions for about 5 hours. And on this stream, on this discussion...
Treachery.
Betrayal. The cake was a lie this entire time.
No, actually, you know what this really is. See, the Russians have a word for this in military operations. It's called maskirovka.
Ah, yes, of course. They actually invented deception in warfare. Sun Tzu got into a time machine, went to 1942 and translated a Russian manual. I read about it on the internet.
Because like in every other battle, it was customary for battles in other countries to tell your opponent what you were doing. Like the reason they called it D-Day on June 6, 1944 is they wanted the Germans to know this is D-Day. And of course they gave all their plans ahead of time and said, would it be convenient for you if we land at Normandy? We're definitely landing at Normandy on these beaches. Certainly the Western Allies, being Anglo-Saxons, didn't attempt to use any deception in the planning of Operation Overlord. So Maskirovka, that is a distinctly Russian invention, and it cannot be really assimilated by anybody but Muscovite Russians because it is deeply tied to the enigmatic Russian soul.
Of course, which one can only understand by reading the 3 famous Russian authors anyone has ever heard of. And without reading which, you just couldn't possibly comment on the Russian yearning to seize Ukraine.
Right, of course. And you were talking about Anton Tolstoyevsky, the most important Russian author.
It's Gogol Anton Tolstoyevsky, I think you'll find.
No, Gogol was a Banderite. He was a pre-Banderite. He believed in the prophecy in Ukraine at the time that later on, sometime in the future, a Messiah named Stepan Bandera would be born, and he followed this. He was the first Banderite, basically. So you cannot. He doesn't have the Russian soul. He doesn't get to write about the Russian soul. Only Anton Tolstoyevsky. Okay.
As only the Primarchs can truly write about the life of the Emperor, so too can only Anton Dostoevsky write about the Russian soul. But, I mean, all kidding aside, and back to more kidding, one of the things we discovered fairly early on we had in common was this shared love of Warhammer 40,000. But those who don't know, what the hell is it?
Okay, so here's the official story, or I'm going to tell you, channel a little bit of Alex Jones here. I'm going to tell you the official story that they want you to believe, that the government wants you to believe. The official story is that Warhammer 40,000 is a tabletop strategy game where you build and paint these little plastic soldiers, and then you make them fight each other, okay? That is a lie, okay? What Warhammer 40,000 is it is a secret British psychological weapons program. Sorry, that's the Hormel chili I've been eating. It is a psychological weapons program. It was developed sometime in the 80s. All right, and then what happened is it got out of control. The Brits lost control of the program and how to, keep it from spreading too much. And what I'm saying is essentially, like you may try to stay away from 40K. You may try to avoid it and say, I'm not interested in that. I'm not going to go and I'm not going to buy paints. I'm not going to buy a bunch of plastic soldiers. I'm going to spend all my good money on that. You can lie to yourself all you want, but it will get you. And sooner or later, every man, woman, and child on the planet will know about Warhammer 40,000. They'll either be reading the books, painting the soldiers. They will be playing the video games. Okay, you can't escape it. Okay, so sorry, that's it. Really
I mean, it is becoming ridiculously ubiquitous in pop culture. I mean,
Well, a lot of times, when like if I tell my own story, it is exactly that. Like you said, ubiquitous, and in the past, like it was kind of always just there in the background. Like you went to a comic book shop and you're browsing and you see this crazy box art, and you're like, "What the heck is that?" And then even just the name Warhammer 40,000, you're like, it takes place 40,000 years in the future or whatever. Because in my day, when I was young, a lot of sci-fi was always kind of like near future or maybe like a century ahead of us or something. I think to me, Star Trek was like way out there because it was like next generation was like what, 23rd century or something. And then here, I guess, okay, I didn't know about it at the time when I was young, but, you had Dune takes place in the year 10,000 something. But then here's this Warhammer 40,000. They're like, yeah, it's the 41st millennium. Like, we don't give a shit. Like that's how far it is. And so you just kind of see it. And over time, you see a meme here or there. And then when they would come out with new editions and they come out with a video game and you're like, wow, that video game looks really cool. These, armored guys or whatever. And you're like, you look at the logo and it's like, yeah, it's that Warhammer 40,000 thing. And what's with this? And then you start reading a little bit on Wikipedia and you run into that very dense lore, but you're like, wow, there must be something here. You start watching lore videos, you start playing the video games, and then one day you're bored and you just start watching the painting tutorials because you're wondering, how do they do that? Next thing you know, I got boxes full of plastic and I'm painting little plastic guys. I'm spending a bunch of money on paints and brushes and just all that. And this largely because of the pandemic. The pandemic came down, lockdown came down right as I got my first minis. And so I really had not much else I could do at that time. So I just went hardcore into that.
For those who don't know, this is a game, an IP made by a British company called Games Workshop, which has a market cap of, and I'm only slightly exaggerating here, the combined GDP of the OECD countries. I mean, these guys rake in money hand over fist, in part because, as James was describing there, you've got the lore of the hobby, which is reasonably cheap to keep up with. They pump out a lot of books, but you don't have to buy them all. And then you have the video games, which are sort of normal video game prices. And then you have these goddamn little plastic figurines, which is what you need to actually play the game. And they are more expensive than a crack cocaine habit if you only take the drugs via gold-plated spoons. It is the most absurdly expensive hobby you can possibly imagine, which is why I think so much of Games Workshop's business model is based around middle-aged dads who finally have the money to buy all of the stuff they couldn't when they were 16.
Oh, absolutely. At this time, I had pretty good, decent salary. And because of the pandemic, I had a lot of free time. You can't play video games all day, right? So, just especially actually when the pandemic first came down for a few months, my nearest gym was closed as well. So I couldn't even do that, And so, I start painting this thing and I start realizing wow, I can actually do this. There's actually a secret to painting Warhammer 40K figurines, no matter who you are. You just go and watch the tutorials on YouTube and just do exactly as they say. It will come out good. It really does. I'm quite proud of my figures, but here's the funny thing. I've never actually played the tabletop game, even though I have quite a lot of figures painted now, and I actually don't care at this point. Obviously because, like I said, pandemic came down, you couldn't, go and meet people. So I just, try to paint them as good as possible. And the thing that gets expensive, we should point out, I think the thing that gets expensive is that if you want to actually play this competitively, you need an actual army, and you need to have so many figures to have an army that equals enough points for the match you want to have. The army's strengths are measured in these points. And if you want to do that, because they divide all these armies into different factions, then if you want to play a certain faction, their units may be more expensive than others, or maybe you need a lot of them. some factions are kind of based on large numbers, like the Imperial Guard, which are kind of just regular human soldiers, or the Tyranids, which are basically the Zerg. Okay, the Zerg actually ripped off Tyranids.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, in fact, if you're wondering, if you played StarCraft a lot and you see parallels between this and 40K, that's not a coincidence. Blizzard were going to make a licensed 40K game, and then they said something went wrong, and they just said, okay, we'll make our own space game, and they just...
Because it should be said, Games Workshop didn't used to license their IP basically to anyone back in the day. And then they slowly started creeping into video games one at a time. There was a phenomenal game called Chaos Gate, which they've now finally made a sequel to recently. There were like a couple of others, but they were sort of very cautious with it. And now they're just blasting it out with a fire hose. If you are capable of throwing together the shittiest mobile game imaginable, and you want to say it is set in Warhammer 40,000, I think you just send like one badly spelt email to Games Workshop HQ, and they will send you their logo to slap on it.
Yeah, the video games are definitely hit or miss. One of my latest reviews was on Bolt Gun, which came out, and it's supposed to be a retro shooter. And I really hate that term because as I point out in the review, it's really more modern than retro. It has a sort of retro look to it. But it's decent. All right. But a lot of the games, I'd say more of them tend to miss than hit. It also depends on what you're into, but a lot of them obviously are like, more strategy leaning because of the way the actual game is played. And the actual game is played. You can watch these games online, people playing entire matches, but it can be really incomprehensible sometimes, because if you watch a tutorial about like how to play the basic game, and they'll take like a squad of Space Marines and a squad of, let's say, Death Guard, and they'll go through the phases of each turn, that is fairly easy to understand. But when people are playing a real match, and then they have all kinds of special abilities they can evoke, or they have special figures that grant certain features and buffs to nearby units, then it starts to get really complicated, and very quickly you're sort of like, what the hell's going on? Or like, why didn't this guy totally mop the floor with the other guy? But pretty much everything is decided by dice, a lot of dice. And so
and watching a game, it is, you watch these games online of the actual tabletop game, and like you said, it's slightly incomprehensible because the guy will just be like, right, so these guys shoot at these guys, but before they do, I activate this stratagem, and that interacts with this special ability, which, because the weapons they are using are actually rapid fire weapons, means that I do this with the dice. But I'm also going to use a psychic power, which is the game's equivalent of magic, to give my shooters magical eyes, so that changes the dice. And it's like this 15-minute monologue that explains why he's about to roll 14 dice instead of 22, and it is incomprehensible to normal people.
If you're wondering what that looks like, they just use like normal dice, like at a craps table. Basically, they don't use like a D20 or this tabletop RPG dice. But a lot of times, like, you have a squad of like 10 guys, and if they have rapid fire weapons, it means like every guy fires, at least in that, when firing that, each guy fires twice and not once. So what you're going to do, usually, if I remember correctly, you need to roll a die for each shot they make. And basically, you'll see a dude with his hands full of a bunch of dice just dump a bunch of dice on the table, and then they have to go and count out all the ones. So typically, depending on what they're shooting at, it's like saying, okay, everything over this is a hit, so anything that's under it, they'll just, sort that out, and they'll be like, okay, these are the hits, and now he only has 12 dice left in his hand, and he'll drop that and determine how many of those wound, and then the other guy gets to make a armor saving throw, so he's going to get some dice against all the wound dice, and see how many of those save, and then that will tell you how many units of the victim, how many become casualties, essentially. And so yeah, I mean, there's a good reason if you're not into, or if you suck at math like me and you're not into that kind of complex stuff, there's a good reason not to necessarily get into the tabletop game, but there's no reason not to like collect and paint if you want to. Because one thing I like is, since I'm not building an army, I buy the models I like. I like Rubric Marines, so I got a box of Rubric Marines. I love Battle Sisters, absolutely, and got a box of those. They are all still in the box, and they are on the sprue, which in 40K fandom, this is known as your pile of shame. Do you have a pile of shame, Dmitry?
So very honestly, I haven't played tabletop Games Workshop games since, God, I think high school maybe. I used to be a Warhammer fantasy player, but I ran into a sort of similar problem to the one we've been describing, which is I really like wargaming, and I really like the strategy aspect of it. But in order to play that game semi-regularly, you needed to have enough friends who have decided to pursue this ludicrously expensive hobby, and they all had to have decided to buy armies. And then even then, your best case scenario is in your area, maybe there are like 3 other people who play this game. And so you get to play each other over and over again. And then beyond that, you get to go to tournaments. And, this was, 18, 16 years ago. A lot of nerdy hobbies have an inclusiveness problem. Games Workshop really had an exclusiveness problem back then. I suspect it probably still does. But back then, these places weren't necessarily super welcoming communities. They were full of exactly who you think they were. So there was a lot of kind of very fragile man children who would flip out at a child if they lost the game, who didn't shower particularly regularly, and who weren't super good at communicating with others. So you didn't necessarily want to go spend heaps and heaps of time at a Games Workshop store, at a community store. So I kind of slowly phased the hobby out, in part because it was really expensive, and in part because no matter how much money I spent on it, I wouldn't get that many opportunities to play the game that I wanted to play the way I wanted to play it. So I have a massive pile of shame. It's just that it is 20 years old and full of dwarves and Bretonnians, which are kind of from the fantasy version of the game. And instead, I became obsessed with Warhammer 40,000 lore. And that is now how I enjoy the hobby.
Yeah, that's mostly what I am into. The painting to make them look good. Some of the video games, but especially the lore. In 2020, as I got into this, I just went hardcore into that. You might call me a lore gar. Only hardcore fans are going to appreciate that horrible dad pun there. But yeah, it's the type of, I could see also what you were saying earlier. I wanted to comment on that. There's kind of a paradox there that when you actually have enough money to, afford to buy the stuff and be able to get to a games shop somewhere where you could play the game, you are typically going to be an adult, probably, in your career when you have a decent salary for it. And I think we all today can appreciate sometimes what a pain in the ass it is to just meet with a friend, just to arrange one meeting with a friend for a few drinks. I have this problem all the time, just looking at my entire 5 days. I got 5 days, and right now, I got barely anything to do. And someone wants to do one thing, and I'm like, okay, maybe this day, and they're like, nah, I'm busy this day, and so it's all that. So I mean, imagine trying to do that, but you're trying to get together to play a game that's going to take at least an hour or two, and a good deal of time just setting up. It's just not happening. You know what I mean? So it's kind of a paradox.
It's like we say in Dungeons and Dragons. There is nothing in the monster's manual that is nearly as threatening to a Dungeons and Dragons party as the logistics of trying to get 5 people to all meet in one spot once a week. That's what kills far, far more parties than dragons, beholders, and death knights put together.
I'm actually trying, once I go back overseas, I might try to ensnare some of my fellow soldiers in some kind of tabletop role-playing game just to pass the time, just because they have to be there. So, they can't leave. So we have lots of, free time. So that should be good. A bunch of, first of all, we got the poor hygiene thing down, at least when we're coming from the field, right? And We got sitting around down there, so we certainly got a lot of factors conducive to that. So I think it'll be kind of funny with a bunch of stone cold orc killers, rolling d20s and stuff like that. So getting into the lore, who wants to? Do you want to have like maybe a little competition of who can try to concisely explain the basic premise of this universe to someone who's just totally uninitiated?
I can give it a go. But yeah, we can take turns and we can pick apart one another's explanations. So, very concisely, the setting takes place in our galaxy, but very, very far into the future. The central premise is that at some point on Earth, there arose a being, for lack of a better term, known as the Emperor, who was not only a god-tier psychic, but also an unparalleled genius. And he created a legion of super soldiers that he conquered Earth with. Then he invented a new legion of super soldiers with which to kill his original super soldiers, and ended up branching out and taking humanity out into the stars, and had a massive expansion of humanity. In order to do this, he created through genetics 20 of these idealized sons of his, each embodying a different aspect of warfare or governance, that became known as Primarchs, and each of them was gifted their own legion of genetically enhanced warriors to lead. However, in shadow to our universe, there is a parallel universe, which is where effectively magic or psionics come from, which is like just behind our reality and teems with sentient and quite evil, inimical beings known as Chaos Gods. The realm is known as the Immaterium, and within them you have the Chaos Gods. And the Chaos Gods live to tear apart the order that humanity tries to build and to accrue worshippers and advance their schemes. They ended up subverting the greatest of the Emperor's Primarchs to their side, and he proceeded to convert about half of his brothers, and there was a titanic conflict that spread this human empire that had pushed back hundreds of alien races and was spreading to the stars based on the Emperor's beliefs in reason and logic and science. There was a giant galaxy-wide schism with millions of super soldiers battling, and the Emperor's chosen son, who turned against him, called Horus, ended up mortally wounding the Emperor while dying himself. The Emperor is now interred in what is known as the Golden Throne on Earth, which is basically a ICU unit. He's kind of in a coma. He sits upon this throne, projecting a giant lighthouse into space, which allows humanity to navigate, while around him, humanity turns into a religiously fanatical, fascistic satire of everything good. Humanity is now spread across 1 million worlds, all of which are constantly at war with a myriad of threats, be they chaos, be they alien, be they internal schisms. The entire infrastructure of what is known as the Imperium, which is this great human civilization he built, is repressive and unbelievably awful to live in. It squashes any free thought, any scientific innovation, and any dissent. And it is effectively a horrific, stagnant, declining empire that survives by virtue of millions, billions of soldiers, trillions of workers, and the mighty fleets of its navy.
Okay, I have to point out one glaring inaccuracy in your presentation there. You have to point out that actually the humanity spread out before the Emperor emerged.
That is true,
for thousands of years, and then became disconnected. So I'm going to drop the nerd voice there. So this is a key thing, though, because it builds off of what you're saying. So there's a few unique points about this universe that makes it so interesting and why you'd care about the lore in the first place. And first of all, I like to say that someone described it as saying, like, Warhammer, or you take Star Wars, right? Star Wars is a story, and there's a universe in the story, right? And people try to build onto it and everything. Whereas, I mean, because Star Wars, initially was just one movie, and it was going to be just one movie, right? So there's a universe in the background of Star Wars, but it was a story, and generally Star Wars is the main series, and it's stories, right? And the universe is in the background, right? And that's why they call it, like, expanded universe when someone writes some novel or something, or comic book or whatever. 40K is more like a universe in which stories happen. And so whatever you read or see, there can be very radical differences between the world and the atmosphere that you get in that story. But there's always common points, right? But the whole idea is, like, the galaxy is so big, it's so diverse, that one world is going to run completely different from another one, right? And what I think is interesting, and I know my good friend in Kiev, Romeo, is going to hate me for this. I feel like he adopts a sort of death of the author approach to 40K lore and insists that there is canon. But the Black Library, that's Games Workshop's, literature wing, basically, they and their authors have been very clear that there really is no real canon to 40K. They have retconned things all the time. And the way you explain this is that what they say is that, when you read every book in the beginning there, it says it is the 41st millennium, right? Well, it is that in the book. But what time are you, the reader, living in, right? And the whole idea of this is that things are being described that could have happened thousands of years ago. And so you could be reading propaganda, you could be reading disinformation, you could be reading legend or myth or allegory, right? And that's all out there, and that's the way they kind of get away, or some people call it hand waving away, contradictions and everything. But you know what? When you stop caring so much about canon, then you don't feel like anything is really ruined. You know what I mean? Like, there's different 40K novels that clearly contradict each other, but who cares? Because they flat out say it doesn't matter. Another thing that makes it unique is how extreme this universe is. Everything is over the top, and we were talking earlier about how humanity. So in the canon, and if you have like a rule book where they have all the basic lore in it, it'll explain the whole rough timeline, right? And basically, there was a time when humanity did all the Star Trek stuff, right? So sometime in maybe it was the 4th millennium or whatever, humans went out into space with the technology, and they used things like arc ships and, flew for hundreds of years out here and settled planets, blah, 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 sailed the galaxy. And there is one important thing is this, in every sci-fi universe, you need to figure out faster than light travel. And the way that, like Star Trek does it is you've got the warp drive, and it has like a warp bubble around the ship or something, and then the way Dune does it is some guys like snort a bunch of spice, and that gives them prescience to do all these calculations, and somehow they fold space and you travel without movement, right? You're just there. Star Wars is kind of soft sci-fi, but they have hyperspace, right? And the basic concept of hyperspace, like any novel, any movie, if you want to do a sci-fi thing, you don't want to bother too much with faster and light, you just say they use hyperspace. They go outside of space and they get somewhere faster. 40K has an interesting approach to this faster and light travel. It is that you have to go through hell. So the Immaterium that Dmitry was explaining earlier is basically a nightmarish realm of just no logic. It is basically Lovecraftian in the sense that, like, you cannot begin to comprehend it, and to try to comprehend it is to go mad, and people are always being driven mad by the warp or the Immaterium. And if you go into the warp, as ships must do, they go into the warps by basically having a psychic person who navigates in the warp, and basically they are, dealing with waking nightmares the whole time they're there. And they need to have special fields around the ship that keep out demons, because if that field fails, then ship is full of demons and you're lost. And the thing about the warp also is that, in hyperspace or warp drives, it's always kind of assumed that the ship gets where it's going when it's supposed to be there. Not in 40K. So when you go into the warp, you're rolling the dice. So that is a thing that sets it apart. And that is an important part of the lore, is this fact that at some point, everything went to hell because humanity had spread throughout the galaxy, but then suddenly there was these warp storms and nobody could navigate anymore. And suddenly humanity lost touch with each other, and some worlds devolved back into an almost medieval existence. Other worlds were taken over by hostile alien races. So just all kinds of terrible stuff happening. And then one day, the warp storms stop. And that's when the Emperor decides, all right, enough of this shit. I'm coming out. He has his coming out. And, he gets the genetically engineered super soldiers, unifies the world, unifies Terra with Mars. And then he's like, all right, it's time to go back out and conquer the galaxy. And that's what he does with his Primarchs. Now, a good question about the Primarchs. The Primarchs, the Chaos Gods, they hate the Emperor, and he hates them. And they just basically, kind of the main adversaries. In fact, the Chaos Gods refer to the Emperor as the anathema. So, not a fan. And, they steal his Primarch babies and scatter them to the galaxy. So when the Emperor is going out to reconquer the galaxy, he has to try to find his future generals, right? And while those generals were waiting to be found, they were often found by certain people and sort of usually adopted by a family or father or whatever, who was sort of their mentor, which begs an interesting question. If when the Emperor showed up on some of these planets and said, oh, you're my son, Magnus the Red, you're my son, I wonder if, his surrogate father ever demanded back child support for taking care of, such a large super being. Because I mean, honestly, it's like, look, I don't care if we're not married or something like that. Your kid landed here. It's expensive to take care of, especially a superhuman being. We need some compensation for that, but I don't know. I guess it worked out. I mean, he made some of these guys Space Marines.
You were talking about the scale before, and I wanted to jump in, because this is something I think about a lot when I compare the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and why for me it often actually ruins a lot of shows like Star Wars even, which I enjoy, but which I find I struggle to suspend my disbelief. Because when you watch Star Wars, which, okay, it's not meant to be hard sci-fi, whatever, but you watch it and everything is happening at such a micro scale. Like, it is all about kind of like 3 people fighting like 35 droids, and it's for like the fate of the galaxy. The one thing that I would recommend to people who are into these kind of large universes when it comes to the Warhammer 40,000 universe is just how good it is at depicting scale. It is all about millions of soldiers, billions of rounds of ammunition, this idea of entire planet factory worlds that are devoted to doing nothing but manufacturing one component of Imperial tanks. There'll be a planet that does nothing but make knives, the combat knives for the Space Marines James mentioned. And it's this notion of this, like, the fact that if you are trying to tell me that your setting has galactic stakes, you can't then show me very, very squad level action and say this is how the galactic stakes are being resolved.
That is a good point, because, yeah, as you point out, like, logistics is actually a thing in the Warhammer universe, where big campaigns are waged because certain worlds are, for example, agri worlds that do nothing but produce food. Because obviously, if you need to shuffle millions of soldiers around, you need to feed them, you need to supply them. And I want to say there is an aspect to the lore where the Imperium is basically all about shuffling resources around and carefully managing their dwindling resources, and always trying to make sure that they can get sufficient manpower to a certain planet. And this is one reason why they have, for example, like the Space Marines. Space Marines are superhuman. So, one single company of Space Marines can take on, maybe a few million orcs, depending on how well they're supplied. They have to manage all the resources in this complex system, and it breaks down all the time. But I like what you said about scale there, and about Star Wars in particular, because Star Wars, a lot of series suffer from this problem, but Star Wars, I think, was the first time I really noticed the problem, particularly after the prequels. A big problem, I think, with a lot of beloved series is that they get so stuck on characters that everyone has to be connected. Everyone has to be someone's father. Everyone has to be someone's sister. Everyone has to know somebody, or, we're going to do a prequel, so now we got to show where this guy learned this technique. So we got to show his mentor, and his mentor just also happens to be the father of this other character, or whatever. And as you said, in Star Wars, this becomes really apparent and irritating, because here you have this, galactic
like 10
war,
dudes.
And yet everything revolves around a handful of people. Yeah, and they all know each other, and if not, have like a familial connection, right? And in 40K, if you're into the lore, for example, you can be reading certain series or whatever, and they have nothing to do with other characters in other places. Occasionally, like, one author might cross-reference something, but like, it's not like one group of guys and everyone knows each other. If you aren't into Inquisition stuff, or actually, let's say if you are into the Inquisition is a very cool sub-faction within the Imperium. We'll probably talk about a little bit later. But there's probably one of the best series ever is the series called Eisenhorn by Dan Abnett, and it is about an Inquisitor named Eisenhorn. Now, there are other series written by other people that are about the Inquisition, and their protagonists are Inquisitors, and guess what? They don't know Gregor Eisenhorn. Their paths do not cross. Their methodology and way of thinking is very different. And the reason for this, because they don't have to be. It's a galaxy, galaxies are big.
And even in those books,
it's a very good thing to point out.
You could, for example, have characters sometimes will reference the written works of Eisenhorn's protege, who ends up getting sort of put into a, spoiler alert, who ends up in a kind of wheelchair and writes some of the great works of kind of philosophy and thought of this setting. And so sometimes in a completely different part of the galaxy, someone will have read those. And that ties it together a bit, but they're not all his son.
Yeah, if something becomes important
they didn't
enough.
all go to school with Eisenhorn, and, they're not all related by blood in order to be important. Can you imagine?
Could you imagine like some Saturday morning cartoon like Inquisition Babies, and it's like little Gregor Eisenhorn and Inquisitor Covenant and Katerina Greyfax.
On this, I really like the way you kind of described
school.
it as like a setting, a universe in which stories take place, because I think this sort of the Inquisitor books are almost all kind of action detective stories. So they're sort of spy thriller action detective stories. There'll be combat and fighting, but it's much more about navigating these incredibly complicated political and shadow games of this vast galaxy. And in contrast with those, you have books that are written from the point of view of the Space Marines, which we've talked about. So we are talking about like 7 to 9 foot super soldiers that are genetically engineered with multiple hearts, sort of more, I think, lungs than they should have. They spit acid. They're asexual. They have had fear completely removed from their psyche, and their books are basically, in most cases, non-stop war. It is them shooting stuff and sort of ripping stuff apart with chainsaws and grenades. And it is a completely different vibe that is simply just happening in a different universe to yet another set of books, which might be, there's a fantastic book, the name of which I can't remember, which is where the main character is an arbiter, like a cop, on one particular planet. And she's trying to get to the bottom of some murders.
Yeah, there's actually in the Black Library, there's actually Warhammer crime genre that's like specifically like crime novels
Mm.
set in that universe. There's also horror. I mean, all 40K books tend to have an element of horror in them, but there are certain ones that are just kind of geared towards that more. But I was going to say another kind of subgenre within the entire
Hmm.
universe is like the Imperial Guard. Like you have Dan Abnett's famous Gaunt's Ghost series. And that's more like, sort of ordinary big war, but also just sort of ordinary war novel because they are ordinary humans. But also there's a probably maybe not the most popular Dan
Yeah.
Abnett book, but still very interesting to read. It's called Double Eagle. And Double Eagle is all about pilots piloting the various planes and stuff of the Imperium. And it is just about, it's basically like imagine Battle of Britain, but on the insane 40K scale where, you're just talking about hundreds of massive bombers coming and, they have fighter escorts. And so yeah, it's type of thing where it's like there's kind of something for everybody. And it's just a matter of finding what you like. I mean, even within the Space Marines, right? You got the Ultramarines who all the fans hate because they're
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah, because you're stupid.
Yeah, obviously.
Like,
Yeah.
they're Romans.
I'm just,
They're Romans in space. Like, just what could you
well,
possibly
also,
not
they
love?
are blue and gold. They are pretty. And also another thing is that Ultramar, where they come from, is basically one of the best run places.
It's like the only place in the galaxy that actually works. Like,
yeah, like you might have a decent shot at a life on some of the planets they run. But there's another one, there's another faction of Space Marines called the Space Wolves. And these are a bunch of like space Viking guys with runes, and they talk a lot of cringy Viking bullshit, but like a lot of people like that. But one of the best parts, though, is that there's a lot of novels that are told from the chaos perspective. Yeah. And there's a great series by Aaron Dembski-Bowden. It's called The Black Legion, but the first, no, it's basically like a duology. So you have Talon of Horus, and then the second book is The Black Legion. And that is told from the perspective of Chaos Space Marines after they lost the Galactic Civil War, known as the Horus Heresy, and they're all sort of trying to piece something together and find their purpose and everything. And it's told from the perspective of this guy named Iskander Chion, or a lot of people pronounce it Kion or Cain. He is basically a Space Marine sorcerer from a Space Marine Legion called the Thousand Suns. And it is extremely well written. I'll say there's actually a part in it, there's a joke written in it where it's one of the few times I laugh out loud reading a book. It was this one, Talon of Horus. So it is great book to read. But just, these are supposed to be the bad guys, technically. But people will tell you that, like, everyone's bad in the Warhammer universe. And I slightly disagree with that. I would say that there are no good factions, but there are good individuals at times, or small
which is one of the things I think the setting does a really good job of capturing, which is that often the books are set or themed around someone with a solid moral compass that is trying to do their best within an incredibly oppressive fascist system, or within a religious cult dedicated to like a death god of war, or to or somebody who is within a society that is incredibly nihilistic, like my beloved Eldar space elves. And what they capture is both the fact that even horrible societies will have good people in them trying to do their best, but at the same time, it illustrates the compromises that good people living within a horrific system have to make, and the things that the way that it changes their perception of morality.
Yeah, and another aspect of the morality is like there's a lot of talk about how the Imperium is like a satire of fascism and everything, and I take a more nuanced approach. Like one thing they talk about the Imperium is like it's very xenophobic, literally. They call all aliens Xenos, and they tend to fight or attack, defend against any alien race, with the exception of the Eldari or Eldar, who are basically space elves. And the only reason they are against them, but they will sometimes cooperate because they have some mutual interest from time to time. And let's face it, elves kind of look like humans, only taller and, pointy ears. And so generally the Imperium is very xenophobic. But I am of the opinion that one thing I got sick of a long time ago, and I think the first Avatar movie did this for me, is I got sick of sci-fi using alien species as stand-ins for other human ethnic groups. They think this seems really progressive to be like, no, you see, like this other ethnic group is just like an alien species and we can get along. And it's like, no, we are all one species. We are all human. And like, I am on every human side against every alien. Because one interesting fact about extraterrestrials, if there was an intelligent race that could actually reach Earth and see us, while they might recognize we are intelligent and that we build things and we get out into low Earth orbit and stuff like that, they have no reason to think that we have rights and that they should, engage with us as equals. They have absolutely no reason to think that any more than we recognize that a dolphin is intelligent, but we don't we still keep dolphins in dolphinariums and aquariums and stuff like that, and we don't give them we don't elect dolphin senators and make special treaties with dolphins. We may have to make one with orcas soon, but that's another matter. So in that vein, once you realize that the Imperium is actually, in an interesting way, the Imperium doesn't really have internal racism or strife. Like, characters are black, Asian, any ethnicity you can imagine. Their names are often a jumble of real existing names from different ethnicities in our time, but adapted over time, like how they would evolve, right? And I'm kind of on board with that, in the sense that when it comes to Avatar, Earth in the Avatar universe is dystopian. They need that unobtainium, and I'm going to support my human race, everybody, who, no matter who they are, against the blue cat people. And if we have to completely obliterate the blue cat people on Pandora, right, that's what it's called, so be it. And we will not go in there and try to take out their tree with ships. Nuke it from orbit. It's the only way to be sure. You can go down there in rad suits or whatever and mine the unobtainium. That's really a positive message of the Imperium.
You are embracing suffer not the alien to live as the
basically, yes, because that's the thing. It's I am for humanity. I do not, like I said, I reject this sci-fi trope of treating different nationalities treating humans as alien species. That's a horrible thing. And when people talk about how someone made a sci-fi thing that was all about how we can really get along because with the aliens, and then they say, oh, it went over people's heads and people were rooting for the side that wanted to kill the aliens, they must be racist. It's no, dude, you just you tried to use an alien species as a stand-in for human groups. You shouldn't do that. That's not progressive. That's, if anything, that can easily lead to regressive ideas. So yeah, Imperium, little bit progressive, little bit woke. So woke Imperium.
There's a lot to unpack there, but one thing I do think that both Avatar and Games Workshop did, I think unintentionally, but also intentionally, because they wanted to shoot cool setting scenes and sell a lot of miniatures, is that they made the aesthetics of fascism, or of kind of the humanity in Avatar and humanity in 40K, incredibly cool. So you have this issue where recently Games Workshop had to put out this statement being hey, we're not actually Nazis, even though we have all of this sort of fascistic rhetoric. Stop thinking Nazis are cool because Space Marines are cool. But much like as an Avatar, they made Space Marines these amazingly kind of cool looking super soldiers that are aesthetically appealing. And in Avatar as well, the tall blue people who are just kind of shooting people with arrows, and they are fighting against helicopter gunships with dual rotors and these walking mechs. And it's watching that, setting aside the politics of what you were discussing, it's not shocking to me that people were no, I'm going to go for the guys who should obviously be winning here if you didn't give the giant blue people plot armor 30 inches thick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another thing, and this kind of ties with Warhammer. I remember one big complaint about Avatar. I have many more, but one was about how the the walking mechs have combat knives that they can, pull off the frame and use, and they have bayonets apparently. And it's funny because in Warhammer 40K, there's a lot of melee weapon use, and a lot of it typically used by Space Marines. You got to remember, first of all, a lot of the bladed weapons, if they're not like the chain sword, which is like a chainsaw sword, they're like a power sword, which has a special field that kind of activates, and then that helps
disrupts matter, right?
Blade.
Like it slits molecules.
Right.
I don't know.
So that's why you could saw the turret off a tank or something like that. Just be careful if it's a Russian tank because the ammo's going to explode. And but yeah, they have that. But also you got to remember this thing is being swung by a massive superhuman. So there's a lot of
in
power
his
behind
powered
it just
armor,
from swinging,
which enhances his strength.
Right,
Like it's hitting you like a tank.
And so a lot of people will say, well, that sounds dumb. Why are they having space battles? All these guys are like using like swords or axes and stuff like that. But there's actually a very smart, logical reason for it, is that if you have to fight, and this goes for Avatar too, if you have to fight on different planets and you have to drop guys down there, that is a huge logistical problem. So if you have the ability to develop melee weapons, then they don't have to be resupplied. They always have something they can fight with if all the other factors are present, like they're superhumans in Space Marine suits or their mechs or whatever. Because here's the thing, whoever you're fighting on the planet, they probably aren't getting resupplied either. So eventually maybe it devolves down into a melee combat, right? Which, by the way, Dune, of course, there's a whole explanation as to why they're usually using things like daggers and swords in Dune and not, laser guns, even though they have them.
Yeah, though I have to say the Dune movie did a really crappy job of deciding at any given moment what kind of weapons pierce those shields and which didn't. I think the book does a much clearer dichotomy behind why you can't shoot that guy, whereas in at least the one that just came out with Chalamet, they were just like, yeah, guns don't work unless we need them to.
Well, to be fair, I'll say, first of all, I can't remember if anyone points it out. So if you're not familiar with this, in the Dune universe, if people have personal shields, and it's to guard against certain weapons, including if someone tries to come at you and stab you with a knife really quickly, the shield will block it. The problem is that if you were to shoot a person with a laser gun and it hits their shield, it's going to cause a massive explosion that's like almost nuclear, right? So people are always concerned about that. And then there's another thing is that you can't use shields in the desert in Dune because it drives the worms crazy and you're going to attract the worms. Something about the harmonics of it or whatever. So there is an explanation. I can't remember if it was all explained in Dune 2021. But I will say this. I do see the problems with it, but it is so hard to depict. Because think about it. They established that if you have a shield, if you swing a sword, you thrust a sword at somebody, well, it's going to block it. So how do you get through the shield? They established that you have to do like a slow cut, right? But how would you actually do this in practice? If you come in swinging, the guy's like, well, that's fast. I don't need to worry too much about blocking because my shield's got it, right? So you have to figure out some way that you get in close quickly, and then you can slowly stab the knife through the shield and then stab through them. And that's just something that is really, really hard to depict in film. It's hard to imagine. But yeah, no, back to the 40K thing. It's interesting, like some of the things you think are that your instinct when you're not familiar with it, you're gonna think that's dumb. Why are they taking these swords with them? Why are they using swords? And you figure, well, yeah, it makes sense if you are managing resources and you need to dispatch, let's say, a company of Space Marines to this planet that's under attack. You don't know how long they're going to be there. You don't even know if you're going to be able to reinforce them or resupply them. But they're superhumans in power armor. So, yeah, giving them swords gives them a huge advantage over a lot of their potential enemies that they might run into in that
It's
encounter.
also, like, the kind of creature... So, Space Marines, for example, are so far superior in terms of combat potential to a regular human in this universe and to the equipment that a regular human might carry. Whereas the weapons that they're carrying, so your standard Space Marine carries something called a bolt or a bolt gun, which basically fires missiles. Like each shell is a missile that sort of propels itself and then detonates within the target. Each one of these things is very valuable in a kind of cosmic setting. That, very frankly, if the Space Marine can just walk over, have all of your little bullets bounce off him, and beat you to death with his sword or his fists, then that is probably the tactically correct choice to make, because your bullets, his bullets, cost more than your life.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is like when you read Space Marine literature, whether it's the Horus Heresy series or the contemporary universe, anytime ordinary humans are usually like chaos cultists or something, anytime they go up against Space Marines, it's just an absolute slaughter. And it's emphasized a lot that you basically stand no chance unless you have like psychic powers,
or the author really needs you to win.
Yeah.
I mean,
You need to roll. You need to roll something very high, and you might have, because it does happen in the game, right? But there's I think in the game it's like, if an Imperial Guard guy kills a Chaos Space Marine or something, it's because he rolled so high that his laser rifle basically shot the Chaos Space Marine through the eye slit of his helmet and straight into the brain, and that would still be fatal, because they have 2 hearts and they have 3 lungs, but they have only 1 brain. But yeah, I also want to point out another thing about plot armor, though, is that so the warp and chaos in general is kind of used sometimes as the universal handwave in 40K, but even then, they sort of insulate themselves from criticism, because the whole concept of the warp is that logic does not make sense in this place. It is incomprehensible. It is chaos, and chaos is chaos, right? So when something happens because of the warp, and it's different than what happens in another novel because of the warp, doesn't matter. It's chaos. It doesn't follow rules. That's the thing. And so I think a lot of times, people, especially people named Romeo, tend to impose, these kind of rules from other sci-fi, whether it's canon or magic system rules or something, to the 40K universe, where doing something leads to, must lead to something else, and there's got to be like a system. And 40K doesn't really have that. It's more like, something crazy happened. It's the warp. That's what the warp's supposed to do. That's why that's why the Imperium fears the force of chaos.
And I will say that there is a tension, and I do recognize this, because it is there's the lore of the game and the universe, and there is the game of the game. And there is this inherent tension, which is that while the game is set within its own lore, there really isn't a direct translation. So before, you would have heard James say, a company of Space Marines, 100 Space Marines and their equipment, can take on 1 million orcs. And in the lore, that happens on multiple occasions. They don't always necessarily win, but that's sort of considered, there's 1 million rampaging orcs, time to drop in 1 company of Space Marines, that'll probably sort it. The tabletop, for obvious reasons, because if James is an orc player and I'm a Space Marine player, James can't bring 1 million models to the table. So in the game, a Space Marine is like the equivalent of 3 orcs, maybe, in terms of combat value, maybe even a little bit less. And so a lot of, you'll see people analyzing the game and comparing it to other universe, and there is always this tension where if you read a book set in the Warhammer universe, it's not unusual for a Space Marine to plow his way through 400 enemies within the space of 300 pages. Whereas if you look at the tabletop, the Space Marine, if you put him up against a bunch of regular humans, he can pretty reliably take about 3 or 4 out before the just numbers and number of dice thrown his way drag him down. And both of those things often come into tension.
Yeah, and that's the thing you see. I mean, you're going to run into this pretty much anywhere. Like, one of my favorite games is, of course, Doom Eternal, and you play as the Doom Slayer, and you're basically a superhero who's given these superhuman powers, and you rip and tear. But you can still get killed by an imp if you're not paying attention, So that kind of thing can, it can happen sometimes. And so this is going to happen anytime you gamify something. You're going to have the situation where something that shouldn't happen does happen. So that's another reason for preferring the lore, though. To me, it's more interesting. I mean, if you look on the tabletop, you have like Chaos Cultists versus a squad of Space Marines. Like, yeah, those Space Marines are, from the tabletop point of view, are kind of going to massacre those cultists, most likely. But in a story that's about something like this, they are just going to paint the walls with that squad, and it's going to happen within like minutes. They're going to cut through them like butter, and it's very satisfying. I think that's one thing that's great about this whole universe and the lore, is that it kind of says like who gives a shit, right? Like, is this realistic sci-fi? No, who cares? If we want to have a battle on some planet where the casualties add up to billions, we're going to do it. If we want to have ships that are the size of cities and they fire shells, like, manually loaded shells, cannon shells that are the size of,
a jumbo jet,
small tugboat. Yeah, a jumbo jet or something. We're going to do it. It doesn't matter. So it's definitely something to look into. Do you think it would be a good idea maybe if we could, I made a few recommendations earlier and I will recap those, but are there any particular books or series that you would recommend to people just kind of getting into the lore, just who are curious about it? And I should warn them ahead of time that don't think you're just going to play the video game, or you're going to read a few books, and you're not going to end up buying plastic soldiers. You will. Okay, it's going to happen. You're going to get into it. You're going to see those. They have those special models that are easier to build, and they're cheaper than their usual models, and that's just to sucker you in there, and that's how it starts. So, okay, but your recommendations?
So I'm a huge Dan Abnett fan. I love pretty much everything he's ever written. We mentioned the Gaunt's Ghosts books before. This is a series of kind of military books where the main characters are ordinary humans who lose their homeworld, but just happen to be very, very good light recon infantry, and that take part in a campaign that covers sort of dozens of worlds, and they often find themselves in the thick of the fighting, undertaking these kind of more elite missions. Of those books, they're all pretty good. There's a particular book called Necropolis fairly early on that I think is like a perfect entryway. You don't even need to have read the books before it, frankly, to pick it up. It is this massive siege of a gigantic, almost sort of continent-sized city in which you really do get to see the personal dynamics. It's war on a grand scale. It's mass tank charges. It's infantry fighting and sort of through the rubble and in the trenches. It's demon machines. It is a fantastic, I think, like taste of how this stuff can be really, really good. So I'd recommend pretty much everything everything there. A lot of people I know are really enjoying the set of books set in the Horus Heresy. So this period where the Emperor has been betrayed by half of his sons, and these gigantic battles are taking place as the rebels make their way to Earth to attempt to basically kill the Emperor and take power. And it is these battles on an absolutely galactic scale that are quite interesting with a lot of great characters.
Yeah, and I should point out, so we sometimes people call Horus Heresy 30K because the Horus Heresy takes place roughly 10,000 years before the contemporary universe, and that's why you always see that it says for 1,000 centuries the Emperor sits immobile on the Golden Throne. So this is how he got there, basically. That is a very huge series. There are about 54 books in the main series. A lot of those are just anthologies, so they're short stories. Sometimes the short stories do deal with some important things, so you should keep that in mind. But there are a lot of reading guides out there because some of them are hit and miss, and there's some books you definitely don't want to miss, and there's ones that are essential. I'd say if you're going to tackle Horus Heresy, definitely read the first 5. Okay, so it starts with Horus Rising, then there's like False Gods, Galaxy in Flames, Flight of the Eisenstein, and then Fulgrim. That's the first 5 in the series. Actually, if people want to put in the comments if they have questions about a particular Horus Heresy book, I've read about 22 of the actual novels in the Horus Heresy series, and I'm pretty well into the Siege of Terra series. When they decided to finally say, okay, we're ending the Horus Heresy series, but we need to make more money, they make a new series called Siege of Terra. And Siege of Terra has fewer mainline books, but it does have a couple like anthologies as well, I believe. That starts with the Solar War, which is just about Horus when he finally gets into the solar system and he's fighting to reach Earth. The Horus Heresy books vary, they vary widely depending on whose focus they are. Most of them, if you like the Space Marines and combat and stuff like that, a lot of them center on the Space Marines, because the issue is that Horus Heresy takes place nearing the end of something called the Great Crusade to unite the galaxy back under, the Imperium. And an interesting aspect of it is that the Emperor wants to create a completely secular society where everything is based on science and reason. So the Emperor is kind of like that fedora hat wearing new atheist guy at like around 2010 who is like, man, I don't have an imaginary
except
sky
he knows for
friend.
a fact gods are real. Like this is one of the super neat things about the setting, is that it's like, imagine if the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse weren't like preaching atheism because they believe it to be true or because they're frustrated by organized religion, but it was in fact a massive galaxy scale psyop to try to effectively like will the gods out of existence by robbing them of the belief that they need to eat, while knowing for a fact that they exist.
Right. So in the process, right, like they outlaw all religion everywhere, first starting with Earth and everywhere else. And the reason they're doing this is to stamp out knowledge of chaos and anybody, getting in touch with the forces of chaos. And the thing is that over time, when humanity was separated, some cultures reached out. They didn't know it. They saw it as their own gods or tradition or whatever, but they were really dallying with the forces of chaos. And the Emperor wants to stamp that all out. His ultimate project is to help reconstruct this, something called the Webway, made by the Space Elves, the Eldari. Or sorry, they didn't make it, but they sort of cultivated it and navigated it, and that's what they use. That's how they get around the galaxy, faster in light, right? And the whole issue is that if you use their webway, as it's called, you don't need to go through the warp, so you don't need to mess with chaos or psychers or all these things that are lead to horrible things. So his idea is, I'm just going to suppress all religion and faith. We're going to have science and reason empire, and I'm going to figure out this whole webway thing in the meantime. Unfortunately, he's kind of arrogant, has this idea that it's better just not to inform people about something. The less they know, the better. That turns out not to be true, and so what happens is when the Emperor is effectively killed at the end of this, spoiler alert, but he is basically killed. It's spoiled by the beginning of the first page in every 40K novel where it says, he's a corpse god. Yeah, but he had to become a corpse before he could be that. And so he wants to create this atheistic, secular society based on science and reason. And yet, ironically, what happens is he dies and he becomes an object of worship. And now what his Imperium has turned into the exact opposite of what he wanted. It is a backward, basically theocracy, all based on the worship of him, and that is something that he explicitly forbade even his sons to do when he was alive. So it's just a big switcheroo, All
right. I think you were going to give some recs.
Yeah, so earlier you might have heard me talking about Dan Abnett's Eisenhorn series. Now, that is actually larger than the original Eisenhorn trilogy. So there's the Eisenhorn trilogy that starts with, I'm trying to remember which one comes first. Xenos comes first. Okay, the first one's called Xenos. Yeah, and if you're wondering what these terms are, so there's a faction called the Inquisition, right? And they answer to nobody but the Emperor, and the Emperor is conveniently dead. And they also tend to work individually. They kind of have their own cases that they work on, and their job is usually to make sure that people don't find out about chaos and to stop heretics and things like that, and aliens as well. And the books are named after the 3 different orders of the Inquisition. So you have Xenos, that's actually Gregor Eisenhorn's own order of the Inquisition, and they deal with aliens, basically anything involving aliens. That's where they have like humans who are getting too friendly with aliens or something and teaming up with them, that would be their purview. Then you got the Ordo Malleus, and they are demon hunters. So they are on the lookout for demons and demon outbreaks. That's anytime the warp bleeds through into reality, demons are often going to get out there. And then the Hereticus, they deal with heretics, witches, psychers, people who have psychic powers. It's like a mutation, and when they use their psychic powers, they are drawing on the warp, and that calls attention to them in the warp to demons, and they will find them. And so this is often a way that the warp or chaos gets into the materium, the real world, through a rogue psyker or just even an innocent psyker just not knowing how to use their powers. And so these are the 3 orders of the Inquisition, and throughout the series, Eisenhorn is kind of dealing with all these things. But after that trilogy is over, there is a new trilogy called Ravenor, based on, was sort of protege. And that's an interesting one, because I'm not going to spoil too much about Ravenor, as Dima did there. But Ravenor, for certain reasons, has kind of works with an ensemble. He works with like specialists, basically. And these books are kind of like, I won't say like a heist because they're not criminals, but it's about highly specialized people working together to achieve certain goals and investigate, uncover things. And then finally, there is the trilogy that is still incomplete, and that is the Bequin trilogy. And that is the first one of that is called Pariah. The second one is Penitent, if I remember correctly. And the third one will be called Pandemonium. I don't know when Pandemonium's coming out, but rest assured I'm going to grab that as soon as it's available. And Bequin is based on a character who will appear in the first, she appears in the first Eisenhorn novel. And she is a pariah. In the Warhammer universe, you have psychers. These are mutants who their mutation is that they have these psychic powers, right? But there's also another mutation. It's rarer, but these are called nulls, or I should say a psychic null, or a pariah. And basically they have the pariah gene, and what that does is it nullifies anything from the warp. It nullifies psychic powers. It nullifies power energies of the warp or anything like that. And so this is, people with this Pariah gene play an important role throughout the entire universe, basically, because there's times when, they have to take down a chaos sorcerer. How are you going to do that? Well, you need to bring, for example, someone from the Silent Sisterhood. These are fighters who are all women. They're all pariahs, and just their presence will nullify the use of psychic powers and magic per se. But what's interesting is that in the universe, pariahs cause unease and discomfort even in ordinary people who are not psychers. Just they have this general, they just make you feel uneasy, right? And there's certain things that can be stronger level pariah that can have very more adverse effects on psychers and anything with psychic beings. And there's a really good novel about that I'll recommend. I want to say the author is Robert Sanders. I really apologize for not double checking that, but the book is called The Atlas Infernal. And there's another Inquisitor named Bronislav Chervak. Again, he has nothing to do with Gregor Eisenhorn. These people never meet. But that is about him and his fight against the Chaos Space Marine sorcerer Azek Ahriman. And that's always a very interesting character. But the Inquisitor Chervak himself is an interesting character. And it's nice because it's one book. It's not a trilogy or a series. So, just one book there. Definitely worth picking up. Earlier, I recommended Aaron Dembski-Bowden's book, short series, Talon of Horus and Black Legion. Both great. A lot of what he has written is great. He's done stuff for Horus Heresy as well, just like Dan Abnett. So I highly recommend that. If you're reading Horus Heresy, some of Dembski-Bowden's really good works are like The First Heretic, for example, which is kind of the story about how this one Space Marine Legion got corrupted by chaos, and has some interesting tie-ins with the contemporary universe, sort of origin stories of certain things. I know we're sort of inundated with origin stories, of course.
Can I jump in with one, which is like very different flavor? There is a series of books by an author whose pen name is Sandy Mitchell, which are the Caiaphas Cain books. So these are about a commissar in the Imperial Guards, or political officer within the Imperial Guard, and they are written from his perspective. They're sort of his diaries as edited by an inquisitor for propaganda purposes. But in this case, and she writes these forwards to them, she shares them with minor redactions with us, the readers. And this Caiaphas Cain is a hero of the Imperium, celebrated everywhere for his tactical genius, his martial prowess, and above all, his courage. But, as you see in the books, he is a total coward who is constantly trying to avoid the front lines, get away from any danger, try to secure a cushy posting somewhere very, very far from any of the million threats in the galaxy. But because of the way that things inevitably work out, he and his loyal adjutant always end up in ridiculous peril and having to save the day while desperately trying to run away, effectively. And it is a very, very different vibe to a lot of the 40k universe, which I am pretty sure is responsible for coining the term grimdark, which you will often hear, where like everything is 10 times worse than it has any reasonable right to be, and everything's got to be brooding and depressing. These books are quite kind of fun in an almost sort of Hogan's Heroes kind of way, and they're very, very charming and fun to read, and there's a whole bunch of them. I think there's about 9 or something that follow this one hero. I think they start with a book called For the Emperor, which was written like 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I just want to say, you often will see very different tone in these different books. I just wanted to recommend one I just remembered off the top of my head, because I read it recently, and it's called Assassinorum Kingmaker by Robert Rath. And that is about the Officio Assassinorum, which is something sort of connected to the Inquisition. They are ordinary humans, but highly enhanced, so they could potentially at least take on a Space Marine in certain circumstances. In fact, it was an Imperial assassin who took out the Primarch of the Night Lords. There was a traitor legion during the Horus Heresy, or sometime after it. So the Assassinorum Kingmaker is basically about a group of different types of specialized assassins from different assassin temples, basically, and they have to do a very intricate mission to basically sort of interfere in the Game of Thrones style politics on this Imperial Night world, because they don't like the Imperium or the High Lords of Terra are not happy about who is in charge of it, and they want to make sure that the right person succeeds the throne so that they will be able to call upon this world and its knights for an upcoming crusade somewhere. And so, again, this is sort of a James Bond spy novel type thing, but a lot of intrigue, a lot of politics, and it came off really good. It's also because it's about knights. When we talk about Imperial Knights, I won't get into this too much, but in the universe, Imperial Knights are basically big mech, machines that host a lot of different weapons, and you will get some of that knight combat in this novel as well. Quite a lot of it, actually. So yeah, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good book. I was quite impressed by it. And I think that would be the main Rex off the top of my head. I did a double check there, and the Atlas Infernal is written by Rob Sanders, so it is Robert Sanders, but just he prefers to go by Rob, so not going to question that. And yeah, those would be, along with those books I recommended from the Horus Heresy earlier, those would be my main recommendations for people trying to get into it.
if you want to give this lore a go, something that's really important to understand going into it is a vast amount has been written in this setting. Unlike any other setting, including the real world, a huge amount depends on the author and the stories they are trying to sell. People have found ways to tell incredibly human, incredibly moving, incredibly entertaining stories in this world, and people have pumped out just the dumbest, most like schlocky nonsense you can imagine, with like the most predictable tropes. I think in at least half a dozen books, the main character ends up killing the unkillable bad guy by making their own plasma pistol overheat and then throwing it at them. Like, that happens on at least 5 different books in the last chapter. People write real...
I immediately thought of one where exactly that happens. It was otherwise a good novel, but yeah, that's what happens.
Really, so people have written like terrible stuff, but people have written amazing stuff, and it is just this fantastically vast laboratory to explore what happens to characters from different places in different settings when they are thrust into a universe that has gone mad, but gone mad in some fairly kind of structured ways.
Oh, and I should just add a rec. The faction known as the Sisters of Battle, Battle Sisters, or their official copyrighted name, the Adepta Sororitas. If you're ever wondering why do some factions in Warhammer have very unusual names, like you have the Space Marines, right? But they're also called the Adeptus Astartes, or you have the Imperial Guard, but it is also called the Astra Militarum, right? Well, there's a very good reason for that. It's called copyright, because you actually can't copyright a Space Marine. You can't really copyright Space Marine in power armor, as StarCraft has proven very well. But if you say they're actually called the Adeptus Astartes, and you come up with this like deep explanation of where they came from and how they have 2 hearts and 3 lungs and all that stuff, then you have something that's a lot easier to trademark.
And at some point quite recently, the Games Workshop literally made a decision and sweepingly started rebranding things precisely in a copyright push. And this was kind of 4 or 5 years ago, where suddenly My Beloved Eldar became Eladari. As you were saying, the Imperial Guard, which everyone still calls Imperial Guard, became Astra Militarum. The Sisters of Battle became, well, they were already Adeptus Sororitas, but but that got pulled out. So yeah, Games Workshop simultaneously handing out their IP to anyone who asks and defending it with a Disney-like fury.
Yeah, I was going to say, I do recommend, there's not a lot of Battle Sisters lore novels out there, but the ones I've read, almost all of them have been very good and entertaining, because the Battle Sisters are interesting for several reasons. First of all, as the name implies, they are all women, and they do wear power armor, but they're otherwise ordinary humans, but they are essentially religious fanatics. They are daughters of the Emperor, essentially, and they are completely devoted to the Emperor, and they are known to chant or even sing hymns in battle while they're fighting. In fact, if you want to see a Battle Sister, a good representation, check out online on YouTube, check out the basically Warhammer 40k 9th edition trailer. It's a CGI trailer. It's pretty well done. And it features a Battle Sister
in battle, he offers us redemption.
Yes. Now, I want to point out, when you're done with that, as a short aside, look up 9th edition trailer Google Translate, and you will find that same trailer where they took all the script and ran it through about 50 languages in Google Translate, and you see the result, and it is absolutely hilarious. This guy who does this, I wish off the top of my head I remember who's doing it, but like sometimes you will have trouble breathing. You'll be laughing so hard at this nonsense. But Battle Sister novels, I can think of a few off the top of my head. There is the author James Swallow wrote some. There's one like Faith and Fire, and another one was it follows that, and it was called Hammer and Anvil. And they're just interesting because they're so unique. They have like face tattoos. They tend to tattoo the Battle Sister logo on their like right cheek or whatever. And like I said, they go into battle. They're basically like hardcore nuns And they go into battle just slaughtering with chainswords and bolters, but also singing hymns to the emperor.
And again, what makes this setting so interesting is that the emperor would absolutely hate the idea of militant non-fanatics going into battle singing his name. They do it anyway, but it works. The thing that like makes the extra layer on top of the setting is that prayer directly manifests in actual miracles and actual kind of divine shields and blessings that actually work. So it is this kind of triple layer of praying to a god who wishes you were atheists, but then answers your prayers anyway because belief just kind of has a force of its own, which is why he was trying to get you to stop believing in the first place.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense because the reason that he was, like you said, trying to get everybody to stop believing is he wanted to protect people from chaos, and he knew that those supernatural powers do exist and those gods do exist. Once they basically get him killed, he's probably like, fuck it, I'm going to be a god then, and I will occasionally answer prayers and grant miracles, and that's the thing that will happen from time to time, is that the very pious will at times be rewarded by the emperor, and some intervention will happen. That's how you get Imperial Guard guy taking down a mech or something,
And what's quite interesting at the current moment in the lore was kind of fairly stagnant for many, many years. I think basically since we were kids, not much moved forward in the sense of where the setting was, and now Games Workshop has decided to kind of surge things forward a bit and have started bringing back one by one these children of the Emperor. And one of the really interesting dynamics around faith is that the two that have come back so far were both absolutely horrified to discover this vast religious edifice that is anathema to everything their father would have wanted. And in both cases, pretty quickly, take the pragmatic route of going like, this is too big, entrenched, and important to dismantle. Even though we hate it and we don't believe in it and it's horrific, we can't do anything about it because it is so central and so bureaucratized. This image of the Imperium as a vast, intractable bureaucracy with entire worlds of nothing but scribes, like taking notes that get burnt as they take more notes. It's a really interesting setting.
Yeah, and what's really funny about it, from another point of view, I think it's in either Black Legion or Talon of Horus, where one of the main things the characters, they're Chaos Space Marines, and what they need to do is they need to escape from this warp rift called the Eye of Terror, because that's where they were driven after they lost the Horus heresy. So they've been away from the actual Imperium for a while and don't know what's going on there. And they encounter someone who is aware, and that person tells them about the God Emperor and how the people now worship the God Emperor. And the reaction of the main characters, these big, Chaos Space Marines, Chaos Space Marine Sorcerer and everything, their reaction is to basically burst out laughing because they can't believe, they find it so hilarious that father who wanted everyone to be secular, who never wanted to be worshipped as a god, who, the main conflict of the Horus Heresy is related to one of the Primarchs wanting to worship him as a god, and now he is. And so all they can do to that is just burst out laughing. And so again, a sort of unique aspect. And I wanted to point out one last thing is that, there are a lot of short stories, anthologies, audio dramas, all kinds of things that the Black Library is putting out, but they also take submissions. So I don't know the exact process myself, but if you get interested in this enough and you're a writer, you may find a way to submit something, and you can write your own novel in their universe. And the reason why this works so well, why it's not like, crappy fan fiction or something, is because they do give you a lot of leeway. I don't know their exact requirements, but there's a lot of leeway in terms of like the type of story you can tell. And so, you don't need to include these particular Space Marines. It can be just some particular thing that interests you in that entire world, in that entire universe. And so, good luck. Maybe someone listening to this will hear that. That'll be their dream. And then there will be a novel written by a listener, and you can comment and say that journey started right here.
With that said, if you write a book And in order to demonstrate how tough your main character or main antagonist is, you have that character take on and defeat an avatar of Cain, the Eldar god of war, in single combat, as happens in about 30 books to prove how tough their characters are. I will find you. I will find you, and I will unleash the wrath of a 60-million-year-old species that should rule the galaxies if it wasn't for you goddamn Monkey.
Okay, yeah, you see, this is what happens when you betray the Imperium, you stray from the light of the Emperor, and you embrace the Xenos filth, okay?
Yeah, no one writes good books about you.
You're going to get disappointed by the lore. But that is kind of a funny thing about the lore. There are stuff that you'll sometimes roll your eyes at, even in books you like, where you kind of know that, like, if a human tries to take on a Space Marine, they're dead. Space Marine tries to take on a Primarch, probably dead. Primarch tries to take on some, demon or something. It's kind of like a hierarchy where, like, this guy has no chance of defeating this guy. You know what I mean? Or like, Space Marine and a Custodes. Custodes are basically the bodyguards of the Emperor, and they are actually considered to be more stronger than an ordinary Space Marine, but they are weaker than a Primarch, right? So there's a kind of hierarchy of it, and that can be a problem sometimes when the battle's about to start and you're like, yeah, I know this guy's not going to win. It's all about, does he actually, like, almost win, something like that.
And then at some point you have Angron deadlifting a city-sized titan of his brother.
Yeah, these things are just going to happen in any universe. And the good thing about 40K is they're just kind of like, yeah, don't think about it too much, just have fun. And that's what's kind of nice about it, is that it's a kind of series where you can sort of turn your brain off. And if you are a type of obsessive nerd who wants to have this consistency and you're looking for plot holes, I recommend reading these books just so you can, like, not treat yourself, but let's say, I recommend it as treatment for your nerdy anal retentiveness, because at first you're going to be like, well, how could he do this or whatever? But eventually you're just going to be like, oh, it doesn't matter. I will be normal. And that's one thing I like, is like, look at the difference between Star Wars fans in terms of, like, their concern over, like, canon and stuff like that, compared to 40K fans when they discuss lore, when, I mean, yeah, they disagree, but the fact is that there's no real canon. Whereas if I tell a person, I like Star Wars, but I don't really like this Jar Jar Binks guy or any of that. I don't like Vader being a kid or whatever at the beginning when he found him. So I've got my headcanon about how this actually went down. They'll be like, you can't do that. George Lucas wrote I don't care how bad they are. I don't care how racist and annoying Jar Jar Binks is. Like, Jar Jar Binks is canon. You will accept that Jar Jar Binks did pivotal actions that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Okay, you have to accept that, or you are rejecting all of Star Wars. Okay, you must accept that Anakin Skywalker was found as an annoying little kid who was doing this pod racing thing, and there are no exceptions. This is canon. You are going against St. Lucas himself.
Whereas half the time 40K is like, hey, why does that tank commander have a sword? And 40K is just like, because it's cool as shit. Like, why wouldn't he have it? Yes, all of our spaceships look like flying cathedrals, even though that makes no sense at all. It's just like, because it's cool as shit, and shut up.
Exactly. And I think in a way it's funny because it is associated with gatekeeping nerds in some ways, but and in other ways it can be kind of liberating if you want to get into a universe where it's like, just do what you're interested in and read what you're interested in and don't give a shit about canon or something like that. It's really a liberating thing.
And the universe is so vast, anything you invent can exist in it. You want to make fluorescent pink space marines that believe that the Emperor truly wants them to decorate distant worlds with flowers after that they have purged them up? Yeah, sure. They're a lost founding chapter. They live somewhere out past the Ghoul Stars, and they're out doing their thing. You go nuts. They are now canon. And no one can tell you otherwise.
Yeah, and it's special for me because the one sci-fi fandom that I was kind of into in my teenage years was the Alien series. Because for me, in the 90s. We had Alien 3, and then we had Alien Resurrection in the 90s. A lot of people hate it, but I can tolerate it. I have my complaints about it, but it's an entertaining Alien movie. And then they started screwing things with Alien versus Predator in 2005, and then there was Prometheus in 2012, and Covenant after that. I will never forgive that. I will never forgive Ridley the Apostate, that's Ridley Scott, for how he tried to ruin this. And one thing I hated was reading the intro of a new edition of Aliens Outbreak, sometimes called Aliens Book 1. It was a graphic novel, and the author of this was kind of regretfully, and maybe he was kind of subtweeting here when he said that now, when we were writing this book, the space jockey aliens were actually like these elephant-like aliens, and they did this and everything. But now that Prometheus is out, well, they're supposed to be the engineers who created man, and I felt so bad because that book that author is doing the intro for, that he wrote, that graphic novel, was actually intended to be the original sequel for Alien. It was written and it came out like in the late 80s, and it was going to start an entire new trilogy. And I highly recommend looking into it. It is often sold under the name Aliens Book 1, and there's Book 2 and Book 3. A few variants on that, but they were great. It built on the universe. It had a very interesting plot. It did end up, it actually begins pretty much with the aliens infesting Earth, which is the thing that everyone was trying to prevent in the original trilogy. It really works. And then this jackass, drunk, overrated director, Scott, just decided to just butcher it with this heresy. And so I just kind of gave up on that whole series. So that's why 40K is kind of like my refuge, where I never have to worry about someone trying to retcon something or making something stupid, because I'll just say, I choose not to believe this. I choose to believe that this is just imperial disinformation that was spread sometime around that time when the story takes place, and we're all good.
I think We're All Good is a great place to leave it. Obviously, on behalf of absolutely everybody, James, all the very best of luck to you and the people you'll be standing beside down there. If you're watching this anytime around when we're recording it, James is on his way to Poland fairly soon and to Ukraine thereafter. So I'm glad we got to spend an hour geeking out about 40K before you did that.
It's funny. It just reminded me that some of you know this from following me on Twitter, but my first time in, my first, let's say, combat tour in Ukraine, and I will continue this tradition as well. I was wearing a Warhammer 40K Space Marine patch on my armor, and I also carry something called a Purity Seal, which you can just look that up yourself, and it's something from 40K that you'll see on weapons and armor and stuff like that. And you know what? I was never wounded due to enemy activity, I can tell you that much. So the Emperor protects. But I do thank you for your wishes, and it's really been a pleasure, and I'm glad that I had an opportunity to finally talk about this with somebody who is quite knowledgeable. And I do apologize to anybody if you begin losing a large portion of your disposable income on small plastic soldiers and paints, but it's going to happen. Just try not to resist too hard. Don't hurt yourself. It'll happen to everybody.
Make sure your loved ones are really understanding, or that you have a secret garage.
Yeah.
A mistress is easier to explain.
All right, folks, hope you enjoyed that extremely nerdy podcast. Even more than that, I hope Games Workshop will pay us for all of this free marketing we've been doing for the last almost 2 hours. Anyway, that was Dmitry Grozoubinski from the podcast Intrigue Explained. You can find a link to that down in the description of this video, and you can also find a link to my Patreon page if you want to help support my work. As always, I ask you to click like, subscribe, share, and since we're talking 40K, feel free to leave all your fan theories in the comments section there, and I will catch you next time.